Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our today's webinar focused on adolescent healthcare visits during the times of COVID and how to navigate communicating with adolescents. Today, we'll have Dr. Jonathan Fanberg presenting on this topic for us. But before we hand it over to him, I'm just going to cover a few logistics with all of you. So just a few webinar logistics as we usually go through. You are in listen-only mode. So we ask that you use the Q&A function to ask questions or make comments. You can find that in your toolbar. Your video screen size and location is adjustable, so you can click and drag it around. And then if you are joining by phone or if there's multiple of you at the same computer, we ask that you either type your email address and name into the chat window, or if you're joining by phone, if you can email milam@mainmed.com, that will send Mary an email for your attendance records. We are offering CME today, and today's speakers do not have any relevant financial relationships with the manufacturers of any commercial products and/or provider of commercial services discussed in this CME activity. CME is available for participants who have signed into the live webinar. So again, that's why we ask for your name and email address typed into the chat box for the attendance records. And once the webinar is ended by host, you should get a pop-up screen that immediately directs you to a survey, but we will also send out the survey link in a follow-up email because on some computers that pop-up is blocked. So you will get a survey in the follow-up email as well. So if you don't get it right away, don't worry about that. And again, if you have any questions about the CME process, you can email Mary at milam@mainmed.com. Funding for today's webinar was actually kind of a collaboration. It was provided by Department of Health and Human Services through the MaineCare office, as well as Access Health. So our speaker for today is Dr. Jonathan Fanberg. He is a pediatrician and adolescent medicine specialist who has worked in Maine for over 20 years, seeing children, adolescents, and young adults. Presently, he is the director of the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine at Maine Medical Center. Along with seeing patients, he works with school health, substance use, adolescent gynecology, eating disorders, and resident and attending education. He also is on the executive committee for the section of adolescent health for the American Academy of Pediatrics. We're very lucky to have such a wealth of knowledge as a resource in our very own state. So we thank you, John, for doing this webinar with us today. And I will turn it over to you. You are on mute still.
No, I'm not on mute.
Perfect.
So thank you. I love this topic. So thank you for asking me to speak on this topic of adolescent health and young adult health, which is also included in that age group. With webinars, they're a little more challenging or interesting or unique in certain ways. And the Q&A we'll do at the end. You're welcome to chat whatever you want, but the chat's hard to see while you're presenting at the same time with slides and so much limited geography on one's web page here. So the goals of what I'm trying to achieve during this next 45 minutes, an hour. One is to review what risks should be screened for in all adolescents. 2 is to discuss how to be effective with getting that information. 3 is to appreciate how to be sensitive to gender diversity. And 4, not 3, to talk about why teens are particularly good fit for telehealth and what's going on with the COVID crisis. So next slide, please. So before I start off with how to go about doing it, you need to recognize that adolescents do take risks. And Caleb kindly supplied to me the YRBS most recent report in 2019. And the YRBS is youth risk related behavior score. It's something similar to that, which is done once a year on all high school students. And they fill out a survey that looks at all the risk factors and self-report, but it's a pretty good marker. And what's interesting with this marker is this is a marker that they do every year. So you can watch for trends over time as far as youth risks. And they look at the highlight things such as alcohol use and substance use, and they look at sexual activity, and they look at things like mental health type things and obesity and other topics like that. So there's really good data out there that adolescents do take risks. Next. It's important to also understand where they take those risks and how to simplify it, because if you understand where they get injured, you're able to address those things. Those are unintentional injury, intentional injuries, substance use, sexual behaviors, psychiatric illness, mental health, and weight. And so that's where we really want to be targeting when we're looking at adolescents on those things. Next, please. It's a little bit of a challenge for our slide to fully understand, but adolescent visits to doctors drop over time, and that's the main thing you need to get out of it. Specifically, if I dig down to the details there, if you take a 9-year-old, 45% of them come in for well visits. That's the top green, olive green color. And 22% of them come in over the last year for acute visits of some sort, but not a well visit. And that's the middle bar. And then the last percent don't come in at all over the last year. And what you see over time between the 9-year-old, where 45% get well visits, compared to the 16-year-olds, 35% get well visits, and the 21-year-old, only 15% get annual visits, that they're tapering off on your access to them. And what that means is you can't hold off for the well visit to touch base on all these things. You need to grab them at any point you can. And even in that 21-year-old, who you're getting the well visit and the acute visits, you're only getting 31% of your patients. And so that means 70 or so percent you're not even touching base with. And that's a challenge. We need to increase our well visits the best we can. We need to take advantage of any acute visit or touch point we have with patients. And at some point, we actually need to think outside the medical model and say, how do we screen for these things and address these issues in non-medical settings, which I'm not going to address today. Next slide, please. We do talk about these hot topics when we have patients in the office. The Adolescent Health Consortium is a project that American Pediatrics did in 2017. And what they did was they did an online survey of thousands of adolescents and young adults. And they asked them questions about what happened at their last doctor's visit. And about 40–50% of the time, we do talk about substances, tobacco, alcohol, sexually transmitted infections, birth control. What that also says is 40–50% of the time, we don't talk about those things. And that's the concern. We're missing these. Next slide. And in that same survey, they determined that we also don't give them private time all the time. In the 16-year-olds, we give a privacy time about 40–50% of the time where we have the parents step out of the room. But that means 40–50% of the time we don't give them one-on-one time. In the 26-year-olds, fortunately, 80% of the time we do give them one-on-one time. But that also means that 20% of the time the patient is still being reported to have a parent in the room. And that is where the American Pediatrics said we need to address this issue as far as one-on-one time. We need to address the issue as far as providing confidentiality, because we know that we get better data out of kids if we give them confidentiality versus if we don't give them confidentiality. And we need to directly talk about what should be happening in the room when we have that one-on-one time as far as content of mental health, substances, things like that. Next slide, please. And confidentiality, 40–50% of the time, 60% of the time we give confidentiality in that same survey, and once again, 40–60% we don't give confidentiality. On the note of confidentiality, it doesn't matter how you say it, whether you say it verbally or have a poster on your wall, but if you do give some sort of confidentiality comment, you'll actually get more information and better information from the patients statistically. Next, please. So asking the questions. Sometimes a teenager may come in and tell you everything you need to know. You don't have to say one word. But I gotta say, on average, that's not the case. More often than not, you need to ask the questions. And many times it works well to have some sort of mnemonic, which you can remember what to ask. Heads is one of the ones that's written up in the literature quite a bit. More recently, they've shifted the letters around towards shades and put that last S at the beginning. So it's still all the same letters. But if you ask the questions as far as where the risk factors are, you'll get the answers. So specifically along those lines, digging into them. H, it stands for home. Who's in the home? Do you have two homes? Do you have one home? I seem to be getting pinged by something. Do you have two homes? Do you have one home? Do you have a fighting family and a family that's going through divorce? That plays an influence on one's health as a teenager. E for education, what grade you're in, what your grades are like, how the grades are changing over time. I worry about a kid who is an all-A student suddenly becomes a C student. I worry about that person more than somebody who is a C student all the time and continues to be C's, because changing grades is a major red flag for something else going on. A for activities. There's really good data saying any activity puts you at better risk for pregnancy, less risk for substance use, less risk for risk-taking during the teen years. And there's very good data saying that self-esteem improves by doing extracurricular activities. In the world of COVID, I don't know what to do with this one because we've chomped out 50 to 75% of extracurricular activities. And that's an unfortunate thing. We need to somehow figure out how to replace that without social isolation occurring. D stands for diet and drugs. The D for diet being, are there eating disorder issues that are coming up or obesity issues that you should be addressing? And D for drugs. S for sex, who you're having partnerships with, what's your identity as far as gender identity, and are you risk-taking or are you being safe if you're having sex? And S for suicide and what's happening with mental health. Next slide, please. So if I look at all of these things, I want to fast track my interview, which I shouldn't do, but sometimes I'm forced to do. Or if I'm trying to tease out what I need to cover at every visit, it's the drugs or substances, the sex, and mental health. Because those are the three things that you're being measured on. Those are the three things that are going to have the most importance as far as outcome for kids. And those are the things probably the most sensitive that they're not going to share unless you bring these topics up. And those are the three things that keep shifting. And so if I'm seeing a kid once a month for anxiety, I actually might ask about all three of those things every time I see him, because sometimes things changed from one month to the next. And that last S, although I left it to the end, it ought to be the top one on my list, because that's the most important thing you can ask about: strengths. Strengths are the way you're going to fix any of these risk factors. Strengths are the way that you're going to propel a kid forward. Strengths are the way you're going to engage a kid and actually being interested in working with you. And so it's very important to not only highlight those strengths, but when things are down and bad and they're doing all these other risk things, how do you convert that all to make it positive for the strengths? It's important. Next slide, please. On that note of strengths, people have looked continuously out over the last 20, 30 years as far as saying, how do you make resilience in kids? And it's these strengths that do it. But in particular, one set of studies looked at 44 strengths, the Search Institute. They called them assets at the time. And they said, if you had 44 resilient features in you, what are the most important ones? And they identified these 7 being support, empowerment, expectation, boundaries, time, education competencies, values, social competencies, positive identity. I don't expect you to remember this list of things, but you'll see some common themes in the various institutes that are out there that have looked at resilience and to be aware of them. But more importantly is my next slide. And my next slide shows that the more of these assets you have, the more likely you're not going to be having problems with violence, not going to have issues with sexual activity, not going to be using alcohol or tobacco, less likely to have school problems, less likely to have depression or attempted suicide, and less likely to use other drugs. And so that's the important thing. I'm not sure which are the best strengths overall to have, but I know the more strengths and resilience you get, the more strengths you have, the more resilience you get out of that. Next slide, please. Other organizations have taken these same resilience pieces and put it into different words. And that's why I say there's some uniformity in themes that come across the various organizations. But this is one I just bring up because this is the one the American Academy of Pediatrics supports, the 5 C's. And specifically, they say contribution, confidence, competence, connection with your family, society, and character. And to somehow be pushing these things as strengths or identifying these strengths in any one individual and saying, where can you be stronger than the ones you don't have the same way? And my next slide. This is the one I like the best because I've used it for the most number of years. It's called Circle of Courage, and it looks at 4 strengths. Sense of generosity. Do you give back to charity? Sense of belonging. Do you have a community, like a coach that you can listen to for a parent role model, or a pastor, or a teacher, or somebody who's a role model for you who can play the role of a parent? It might be a supportive when you're separating from parents. A sense of mastery. Do you do something good? I don't care what it is, but something. And independence. Are you given enough opportunity to test the water as far as what you do and what you don't do, but not get in trouble with those things? And typically with somebody who's at a well visit, I will look for those 4 things. And if I'm seeing that there's a gap in one of those things, I say, hey, we can make you even stronger by looking at how do you get a better relationship with somebody in your community, or how do you give back to the community through generosity or something like that. Next slide, please. So I'm doing things differently, as I sometimes do. I typically will bring a patient to me, in with me, and do an interview live. And for this visit, because it's a webinar, because it's being recorded, because it might be put on the internet, things like that, I was asked to actually pre-record stuff. And so I actually do have a patient with me today, but the patient was seen 2 days ago. And we're going to interview that patient. The patients that you will hear through my webinar were told a couple things in advance. One was that it would be shown during this webinar, okay, and that there are people from all over the state potentially in this webinar, and that we didn't fully control the crowd. But we also told them that we would ask any participants on this webinar to consider the content and information on this webinar to be sacred, and not to be taping this, not to be copying this about the patients. We also told them that they could skip any questions or not respond to any questions, or change the facts if they were very sensitive facts, and to rephrase things in a way that they were more comfortable with. Some of the tapes are a little bit jolted because we edited out some of the pauses to make it shorter for this, but we didn't change the content of what they had to say. And lastly, the one things that I hope you see through this is that I'm demonstrating how one interviews a teenager or young adult, how one uses Zoom to make it work with teams, because that's one of the things about COVID that's very useful, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it after. This goes about 7 minutes. Go ahead.
Sorry, hold on, it's loading.
I'm hoping you see that I'm non-judgmental in my approach, that I'm accepting what I hear, that I'm teasing out the strengths the best I can, and I'm trying to make a connection because those connections are vital. I don't care if the connection happens with a teacher, a coach, a physician, a parent, an uncle, an aunt, a big brother, but those connections are what give you community and also security when things are becoming risky for a teenager. How we doing, Kayla?
It is coming. Sorry, it was loaded up and then it just paused and froze. So it should be here. Hold on. Share. Of course, when you preload something, that's when it decides to not work after. Okay, let's see if this will work now. It's not letting me make it full screen, but we have the audio and the video, so this should work, okay?
So thanks for joining me in my virtual Zoom office, Hannah. We do with all patients in the beginning of visits that are Zoom visits. Usually I'll talk a little bit about confidentiality on the Zoom visit. And there's 3 things I tell all the patients. One is it's like an office visit where everything is confidential that you share with me, and I'll be recording in the chart the same way. Granted, this is for webinar, so it's not quite confidential the same way, but that's what I would tell you if this was a Zoom visit in my office. I'm telling you that that we record things in the chart the same way, that we build insurance companies the same way as an office visit, and that we're paying for confidentiality. We typically in our office visits are not video or audio recording any of this material. And a document can be found at our office that describes all these things if you wanted it. And then typically if I was meeting with you alone in my office and your parent was with you, I'd be asking to talk to you alone for a period of time. And during that time frame, I would give you confidentiality, which I would share with the parent as well. I'd say something to the extent of, when we talk alone, Hannah, everything you tell me is going to be private. I'm not going to share it with your parent unless you give permission to, unless you tell me you're going to hurt yourself or hurt someone else, in which case I need to involve the parent somehow. And that would be the line I would use if you're under 18. If you're over age 18, I would say you're over age 18, so you have a lot more confidentiality even beyond that. And I would talk about that. So Hannah, can you tell me your age and a little bit about what you're doing in life, or where you're with education or school or other things?
So I'm Hannah, and I graduated in 2020. I had to do an extra year, so I was a super senior. I'm looking into going into the Coast Guard. Home life is good. Off and on, we're looking to move soon. I'm really in love with volleyball. I used to do track a lot, but then I was introduced to volleyball, and I fell in love with it.
How would you say your health has been overall?
My health overall has been definitely confusing and off and on. My anxiety-driven eating disorder definitely has been kicking me in the butt. I know I've been a lot more depressed and frustrated than usual, so that definitely affects my health. My migraines have been picking up more and getting worse.
So you have a lot of things that deal with in life. From the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are you actually doing for activities now? Because you're finished with school, high school that is, and what are you doing for activities now?
Right now, I'm obviously limited on activity, but I'm working on getting my weight up so I can start running every morning and start doing my workouts and get back to work. I really, really have gotten into drawing, random pictures and stuff, and writing notes to myself.
So it sounds like you have some strengths or passions in life, like the drawing piece, the volleyball.
Yeah.
There's things that keep you going when things get stressful. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah.
Do you have other strengths that you're really proud of?
I'm very smart. I'm very funny. I have a very good personality. I know how to diffuse situations sometimes.
So you're good with people then?
Yeah.
Cool. So when I see teenagers and young adults in my office, I ask about all sorts of risk behaviors. Some of them are like substances. Do you use cigarettes, pot, alcohol?
Yes. I smoke pot and nicotine, and I do drink, but I haven't been recently.
Have you tried harder drugs than pot?
Oh, no.
And how much pot do you use on a daily basis or weekly basis? Or
maybe 4 to 5 joints.
and why? Tell me what's your reason for using it?
It's a big stress reliever. It definitely helps me eat when I'm not feeling motivated to eat. I guess when I'm really down, it just brings me happiness. It just changes my mood.
See, if I could find something that could improve your stress and give you happiness, would you quit pot?
Yes, probably. I'm going to have to for what field I want to go to.
Your goal is to quit someday. That's actually the point that you plan to do. It's good.
Mm-hmm.
Have you started dating at this point?
No, I have not.
And are you attracted to girls, guys, both?
Guys.
And do you see yourself as a girl, a guy? Not really sure.
A girl.
And have you started having sex yet?
Yes.
And are you on contraception presently?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Should you be on contraception?
What's contraception?
I'm sorry, birth control.
Yes, I am on birth control.
Great. Which type, can I ask?
IUD.
Okay. And it's working then? Okay.
Yes.
And so you started having sex yet, but you say you haven't started dating yet. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. As far as happiness, I have a 0 to 10 scale where 10 is like happy, happy, and 0 sad, sad. What are you?
A 5.
On the range of best days and worst days, how far do you go when the extremes exist?
I can get to a 10.
On the worst days, how low do you go?
I can go to a 0.
Okay, you go the whole extreme then. What do you do in the 0 moments? How do you get out of them?
I usually like to close myself off and just kind of think about everything. Usually a good cry helps.
Do you ever get so sad you think about hurting yourself?
No, I used to.
And so crying, you say, helps. Are there other things that help you as far as get through the bad moments? So.
Definitely writing. I write to myself sometimes and just write in my journal.
Good. So that's a therapeutic thing that you pull out.
Yeah.
That's great. You have one of those things. Do you have other people you can reach out to if you're really distressed and down the 0 zone?
Yes. Drug counselor.
Fair enough. So you have counselors that you're working with?
Yes.
Good. Other questions for you. If there was one thing you could make magically improve in life with a magic wand, what would it be? What's the biggest stress in life that you just zip it away and replace with something good?
My weight.
Okay. So that's one of the things you struggle with, huh?
Yeah.
In what way?
I don't know. It's been very frustrating recently. I have been eating, but not the way I want to be eating or the way I should be. I just haven't had like a need to, not like a need, like a want.
And do you think about your body image quite a bit?
Oh no, no, never.
Do you ever wonder if you have an eating disorder?
Sometimes.
You said at one point you called yourself anorexic. Is that correct?
Yeah, I looked at, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. So it's something that you're working on or desire to work on. That's one of your priority things that you wish you can improve. Why do you want to improve that?
It's just such a stress thing in my life that I wish that I could figure out and get over and done with and not have it be such an issue to sit down and eat a meal.
Yeah, so you wouldn't have to spend more time with it, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to cut the interview short because I'm doing this over webinar thing and pre-recorded. But I would have asked a couple other questions in more detail. I would have dug down more into contraception as far as are you using condoms, things like that. I would ask about, have you had bad experience with dating, such as been raped or other things? I would have asked about what struggles in your household exist. Like, do your parents get along? Do they fight? Are they all over you? Do you have support systems actually you can reach out to, or a parent you love and is there for you all the time? And those kind of types of questions I would have asked more. But more so, I would have honed in on your things that were most important to you. And that's the volleyball, the drawing, the positive career, eventual stuff. What's most important from a health standpoint related to nutrition and weight gain. And those would be the things that I would probably tease off the most for. So thank you for joining.
So what you heard was an interview, and Hannah was very helpful with doing it. She's somebody I know from multiple visits over time, and within 7 minutes, I've achieved quite a bit of information gathering. Recognize that typically I have 30 minutes in my office, and so I'm not so forced as the interview might have appeared, or we took all the pauses. I also would say that the pieces that I failed in was some of the terminology. You heard it. She didn't understand the word contraception. I actually, when I listened to the tape just now, I realized I said it a second time at the end as well. And he's used the words that they understand. And the same thing with dating versus having sex. Those are two different things nowadays in the adolescent world. And so understand their terminology and using it the best they can. The way I ask questions is the way I ask questions, and everybody has their own way of doing it. But it's the concepts that are most important. I'd also say that the one piece we didn't get to during that was goal setting. And how do we take one piece such as the eating disorder that's most important to her, or to me might be the eating disorder plus the marijuana is most important to me, and how we find some happy in between with shared decision-making for setting a goal is an important piece. So typically I will also allow patients to answer audience questions at the end of a visit or the end of a lecture like this as well. And since I don't have that opportunity, I went ahead and asked Hannah some of the common questions that come up when I do talk with an audience with a patient. And that is this next video that Kale's about to show.
So Hannah, one thing that's always asked of audiences when I talk with audiences about teenagers and how to interview teenagers is what they like in a physician's office or don't like in a physician's office. How could another primary care doctor be at the top of their game and make a teenager, young adult such as yourself be happy with them?
So I know what I love most about a good doctor is him not just nodding and agreeing with everything, actually coming back and saying something that makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, takes a second to make it make sense and click. A doctor that is calm and cool and collected, and a good doctor that knows how to talk to you without triggering you and making you upset. I guess the bad side of not having a good doctor is agreeing with you on everything and just not feels like he's rushed, like you feel like he's rushed, or her.
Have you had any bad experiences with the office without mentioning a name or anything like that, or a person, things like that?
Yeah, a doctor I had before, just very fast-paced, always agreeing with me and not really talking about anything, just kind of pushing it along and get out of my office type thing.
So Hannah's, those are the common questions come up, and those are actually some of the common responses I hear from other students as well, or patients as well. I was asked to talk about a couple things during this webinar. One is how to talk with teenagers, how to get information, how to find the risk factors. But the next stop that I want to touch upon is gender and how to be sensitive with gender. Can you move forward 2 slides, please? Gender is a new world compared to 10, 20 years ago as far as how we handle it in the medical world. We're getting smarter about how we do things. We have a long way to go still. There's whole sorts of terminology coming up. There's all sorts of patient requests. They're coming up. Identity is changing in various levels. And to that extent, we need to keep up with the changes in what we're doing with our office. Next slide, please. I like this one slide called the genderbread person a lot. And the reason I like it is because it shows the spectrum. And it's the recognition that any one person can have gray shades of a lot of things. They can have varying degrees of gender identity. They can have varying degrees of which gender they're attracted to. They can have varying degrees of what their body parts consist of, the actual gender pieces biologically. And they can have different levels of expression as far as how they portray themselves. The most important piece is recognizing what the patient wants is the most important thing. And so my question is, what does the patient want to be called as far as a name, okay? How does the patient want to be referred to? He, him, she, her, something else, they. What does the patient want in the chart? And so they might want to be called one thing, but want something else to show up in their chart. What does the patient want to share and with whom? And so I have one patient where every time I see the patient in the room, I call the patient Tom, I make up the name. Every time the mom's in the room, I'll call the patient Teresa, okay? And keeping track of all, it's really hard. But if you really want to do the best job for the patient, it's recognizing that piece. Next slide. This is the same genderbread slide. It's one version earlier, but I liked it a little bit better just because it shows the grades. There's lots of shades of any one of those 4 criteria that one's looking at in any one patient. And so many times holding up a slide like this to a patient and saying, where do you stand on gender identity? Which extreme or the other extreme? Where do you stand with expression? Where do you stand with biologic sex? Where do you stand with sexual orientation? When we first started talking about this in our system said, oh, this can be the rooming person's job. They walk through these things, a checklist, we'll put it in the chart, we're done. And then we realized that's not in the patient's best interest. We don't want to out people inappropriately or untimely. We want to be very sensitive to what their needs are and what their interests are as far as who knows what. The patient might be very comfortable telling you one thing, but not want your staff to know about it. And so we need to be sensitive along those lines and to adapt to those pieces. Next slide. Why is this all important? Because of health disparities that exist in gender type topics. And whether it's LGBTQ or it's transgender, these are all issues that come up. And specifically, people who are dealing with gender have greater discrimination with housing, with health insurance, employment, marriage, adoption, and retirement. People who are dealing with gender issues have lack of laws for bullying in schools. They don't seek preventive services to the same degree because they're fearful of the medical system. They feel like the medical system has served them wrong. They don't get HIV and STI screening the same way because they're not seeking care from the medical system. So they're more likely to have these diseases that go on for longer before they're treated. They're more likely to run into risks with obesity, more likely to run into risks with partner victimization or violence or rape. They're more likely to have mental health issues such as depression or suicide. And they're more likely to have tobacco, alcohol, and drugs. They basically have almost every health disparity out there in disproportionate frequency. Can I have the next slide? One of the most critical things that I want to hone in on is this attempted suicide rate. So how your family and society around you accepts whatever gender you identify is critically important. And specifically on the left there, if you're accepted by your family, your risk of suicide is about 4% as far as attempted suicide. If you're not accepted by your family for whatever you identify as, your risk of attempted suicide is about 57% for transgender kids. And this is a huge difference, but also horrifying in the fact that that 4% is the same as the regular population. So if your family accepts you your risk of attempted suicide is the same as the rest of the population compared to if they don't accept you. And I bring this up to parents whose kids are identifying as a different gender than they were biologically assigned at the beginning of life on a regular basis. Okay, the next. Our tools in our computer are starting to help us with this. And I bring up Epic because that's the one I work on. I'm hoping that other systems, EMRs, are also doing the same type of thing. But Epic, as of about 6 months ago, has a sexual orientation page. And the sexual orientation page allows you to check boxes that might be appropriate to the patient. I'm cautious with how I check these boxes. And specifically what I mean by that is I let the patient know that we have this section of the chart. And I ask them, do we want to check these boxes together? And I'll pull it up in front of them and I'll say, how should we check these boxes? Because once we check these boxes, yeah, we can change them, okay? But everybody else in my department, my office can see these, okay? And it's a sensitive part of the medical piece, but it is visible to other pieces in the medical system. And so it allows for one to identify their orientation, allows one to identify their gender identity. It allows us to record what their sex was identified or assigned at birth. It allows us to put the pronouns that they prefer. And what's nice is those pronouns will carry over to many of our templates when we print letters or other things like that. Next slide, please. It allows us further down on the same page to put the organs that exist in this patient and how those organs are changing over time, such as this patient had top surgery. And so I can say initially there were breasts at birth and the breasts are not there on the current organ inventory. And I can check these or change these as they occur over time. Next page. And this is, we're going to look another slide. So with the video. So once in the concept of interviewing people in advance, I interviewed 2 people with gender transition. And I asked them what works for you in the medical system and what's not working for you in the medical system. And how can we be better doctors when we see people? And so you hear those tapes. The 2 comments I would have is you're going to hear from 2 different patients. One was assigned female at birth and identifies as transitioning to a male. And one is the opposite. And you'll be able to tell by their voices that they're a little bit different in voice. I would say that they both have low voices, or one has a moderate voice and one has a lower voice in the process. We've given them names of Becca and Sam, although that's not their real names. They chose not to have their video presented with us, but they chose to go ahead and use their audio, and they're aware that this is being used for a webinar. Can you give me a little brief background of transition and what your history is?
I am 24 years old. I do not speak for the entirety of the transgender community. Everyone has very different experiences and different kinds of things that they would like to address in their medical care. But this is primarily just my experience going through the transition process. So I started experiencing minor levels of dysphoria probably in around middle school when gender roles really become a little more pronounced. I remained closeted until about senior year of high school, and I told a few friends then, and then I went to college, and that was like a really good experience for kind of getting out of my comfort zone and exploring my identity a little bit more. And it wasn't until after college that I decided to look into kind of the medical side of what could be done for transition.
So I am 21 years old. I was assigned female at birth, and I currently identify as transgender male. I have always known since probably the age of 3 or 4 that I was transgender. Didn't put a label on it until I was about 12, and I watched a YouTube video, learned what it was. Due to my home circumstances, I didn't feel comfortable coming out when I was a teenager. And then when I went off to college, I decided to come out socially and eventually to my friends and family.
Along the way, you've had experiences with a lot of different medical systems. Can you tell me a little bit more what's worked, what hasn't worked for you when you're in medical systems, or what's been comfortable?
Yeah, in navigating a couple different systems, I definitely found a few pros and cons of each one. But I first want to say that just starting the process of looking into the medical side is really a huge decision, and it is oftentimes like a step out of one's comfort zone to kind of just address that, and it feels like a very official step to take. But yeah, when I started to look for care out in California, and then a few things fell through with insurance. And so I had to kind of start over when I moved. And so I started in Maine. The insurance still kind of didn't work out. So I'd say the insurance side was definitely the main drawback of getting this kind of care, as a lot of healthcare plans don't really cover it. Overall, I'd say the experience has been difficult, but it's also that kind of level of difficulty that made me more sure that I was searching for the right reason. Like, the barriers in some aspects did make me feel like, okay, I still want this, even though like there's a barrier here. I'm going to try to overcome it in order to keep pursuing care.
I think a big piece for me is just a general awareness of transgender patients. So recognizing that people have all sorts of different body parts, different needs, sort of erasing that cis normativity. For example, when people with cervixes and vaginas go in to get a pap smear, there are a lot of people who don't look like a typical assigned female at birth after they transition in our hormones, and a lot of people have had negative experiences with providers.
So you're talking to a bunch of primary care providers right now. How should they ask and make it most sensitive when they're asking? Should they be asking every time they see you? Should they be asking her physicals? What words should they use to make it comfortable?
Well, depending on how often you meet, maybe if it's just for like the yearly checkup, I would say maybe asking every yearly checkup is probably sufficient. In terms of broaching the topic, I feel like being a little blunt, but also sensitive at the same time can be very key. So, for example, asking like, "Are you comfortable talking about this subject?" So in this case, it'd be gender. Like, are you comfortable discussing dysphoria? It really kind of brings the patient into the loop of what they're comfortable with discussing.
Have there been times where you shut down and you said, I'm not talking with this provider about anything else. I'm not going to be judged or challenged by it, and so loops are closed, that type of thing?
Actually, this was not a medical provider. It was more of a mental health service provider. But my experience was when I had shared feelings about possibly being transgender as an adolescent. I think I was about 16 or 17 at the time. The provider sort of confused gender identity and sexuality and told me that they thought I was a confused straight female. I had thought, since they were a mental health service provider, that I could be open with them. I think confidentiality for minors is most things are confidential unless you pose a threat to yourself or others. In that instance, I just did not want to talk to that provider again, even though I had built up a level of trust with them after working with them for about a year.
And providers slip up, okay? Sometimes I know somebody identifies as female, but you might use the word he or she, or him, or might use the previous name that's still in the medical record because it doesn't give me guidance along those lines. What's that do to the brain of somebody who's getting that name mislabeling? And how can a provider recover at that point?
In order to answer this, I want to kind of break down two categories of dysphoria that many transgender people experience. One would be a social aspect of dysphoria, and the other would be a bodily dysphoria. I think the topic that you're asking about would be the social aspect of being misgendered or misnamed, or having used a dead name, which is the name that was before. Generally, when you are misgendered, it feels like you are being labeled as inauthentic. It's almost as if the provider doesn't acknowledge that you are the gender that you say you are. So that can cause definitely a negative emotional response. In terms of recovering from that, I would say from the provider's perspective, for a lot of transgender people, I would say just a simple apology and any attempt to not make the same mistake again would probably be very, very appreciated by the patient.
Honestly, it's just people are human and things happen, mess up, especially if you've known a patient for a long time. I think general guideline for best practice is similar to best practices outside of the scope of medical practice, which is just to quickly correct yourself. If you're talking to a person who identifies as male and you accidentally say she, just say, oops, sorry, he said this. And then just quickly move on. Don't make a big deal out of it. It's more awkward when people try to exaggerate and make a big deal out of it.
So I chose people who were over age 18, but close to age 18, in part because I didn't have to work with release from parents. I knew they were all good participants. I knew they all had good resilience within them, so they could tolerate this type of interview in front of a webinar. And I recognized that they also had really good insight as far as what their past was like. But you could use all these same techniques as far as discussing with teenagers, as you have heard on these videos. The last topic I want to touch upon is COVID and telehealth, and recognition of how we can use telehealth with adolescents and young adults. I think it's great. This has opened up new avenues for myself, for my system, for my patients, which is phenomenal. There's a couple of things that we've noticed as we've started using telehealth. And we use telehealth probably in about 25% of my patients, and I think that's here to stay even after COVID's over. But picking the right patients is important. And I think telehealth is great for mental health issues such as anxiety, depression.
So there are a lot of myths when it comes to best practice.
I think telehealth is great for dermatology things, and sometimes they have to supplement that with a photo that comes through their electronic medical record report. I think it's great for non-contact visits where you don't have to touch the patient. I think it's great for college kids. Okay, suddenly I had in the past college kids I could see 6 months of the year, and then I trade off and share with this college nurse 6 months a year. Now, as long as COVID's going on, I can practice across state lines and involve college kids. After COVID's over, that cross-state line thing might become an issue, which we might have to curtail. And I think it's great when people live distances from far around the state. And so as an adolescent medicine specialist, I'm now consulting on patients from farther than outside the Portland area. We were seeing patients from all over the state previously, but now it's greater along those lines for consults. And so we open our doors for that as well. I think it's not so great when people need an exam as part of the picture, and that's where things fall apart. And then as you saw me do with the first video, as far as a Zoom visit, that would have been exactly like a Zoom visit. Describing the confidentiality policy, what your medical record policy is, your billing policy is very important as part of the process. And document that in your notes. Next slide. Setting the stage is really important so everybody knows where to go. And just like in my office, I tell parents and kids, okay, I'm going to see you both together, and I'll see your kid alone for a period where it's going to be confidential, and I'll have a parent come back in at some point. Same thing with telehealth. And I'll set the stage. I'll make use of Zoom's waiting rooms, and we use Zoom presently at least the most. And there's a waiting room in Zoom where I can send the parent out to the waiting room, and they might be at a different computer in the same building, or they might be at their work on their computer, and then bring them back from the waiting room. So it's with some frequency, I'll involve parents on the same Zoom visit and bring them in and out of the waiting room, or have them at different sites or things like that, or plain old step out of the room. I also say along those lines, for privacy purposes for the kid, they might want to put some headphones on because parents hear down the hallway what's going on if they really feel it's going to be sensitive stuff. And I'll ask them in the beginning of the visit, like, do you feel like you have confidentiality and privacy where you're sitting at the moment in recognizing somebody's in another room? Telehealth's opened my eyes to a whole nother set of things which I never knew existed. Usually as part of my visit, I will say, tell me something in your room that you're proud of. Okay. And usually say, oh, I'm in my bedroom, or I'm in my college dorm, or something like that. And I'll get a tour of their college room or their bedroom, and with highlights of what's their fascinating thing, or their uniqueness, or their strength, as I might find in some cases. So I saw a guitar on one kid's wall. I was able to talk about that. I saw somebody who was using paint chips on a wall as far as collage. And I said, that kid's autistic. And sure enough, she said, yeah, that's my painting theme, is using paint chips from lots of different colors. And then I also saw some words that was graffiti on a word, was like something like hate myself or hate, something like that. And although I knew the kid was depressed, it gave me more highlight how intense it was. And the kid might be brainwashed themselves to validate that type of feeling of depression. So I've had better insight just being able to get into their homes. And then don't forget about routine preventive health if you're doing Zoom visits. For the CRAFT and PHQ-9, you can share your screen, and you can go through a checkbox type thing with that. And that's a successful approach. I dream about the day where I can send somebody a survey through their electronic portal, and they fill it out beforehand, and it's available to me when I begin the visit. That day hopefully will come. And don't forget, there's some routine preventive mental health that still needs to happen even if you're not seeing them. And that's the chlamydia testing or immunizations, which might be a valuable part of adolescent visits. And those could be done through clinics. If your clinic has set up a shot clinic, just to come by, get that, go on, or it can be done by drop off urine or vaginal swab for chlamydia at a local Nordics lab, as it might be, or whatever lab you have locally instead. So there are ways to get around that as well. Next slide. So I've talked a lot. I think I've left us a couple minutes for question and answer. I don't know if we can take the phone lines off or go through chat or unmute people. I'm happy to answer any questions or things that come up on the slides.
Yeah, so if people have questions, you can certainly start to type them into the Q&A. And then I guess I would just kind of ask John, in the meantime, while we wait to see if there's any questions that come up, have you had, I guess, how do you best handle the telehealth visits when the parents may be standing over the shoulder and you're trying to have the conversation with the, I can just imagine, like, that must be really hard for the teen. So how do you really get those adolescent, like, honest answers if you're fearful a parent might be lingering in the back?
Setting the stage is critically important. And that means telling the parent at the beginning with the kid in the room, say, I'd like to talk to you both initially. And I'm going to ask your parent to step out of the room, and I want to talk to the kid alone and confidentially. And then I'll invite you back. So we'll summarize things. I recognize there's been cases where I said that and I say, okay, I want to talk to you alone. And the parent picks up the computer and walks out of the room with the computer. And I found myself talking to the parent alone. I said, whoa, no, I want to talk to your teen alone, and that type of thing. It's and I do worry about parents who stand outside the door and eavesdrop. And I tone the kid on that, saying, hey, be aware that somebody might be listening through walls or just outside the door. Do you feel like you're in a comfortable spot? Do you want to use headphones so at least they don't know why I'm here? All those things. And then we do the best we can with that piece. I found that to not be a burden or a hurdle, that parents have quickly walked out of rooms, and maybe that's because I have a standing relationship with a lot of these kids, and so they know what they're getting, I know what I'm getting. And likewise, the same thing in my office. It's a very rare parent who won't step out of an exam room. It's a little bit less rare kid who doesn't want the parent to leave the room. So somebody with a lot of anxiety, the kid might say, no, I want my parent in the room. I'm finding with Zoom, actually, they're okay with the parent leaving the room, which is kind of interesting also.
Interesting, and more comfortable with the technology piece. Also, I guess the questions kind of come up a few times. I've heard it in different groups talking about their waiting rooms and how with COVID, are you staging your waiting room? Are you, I mean, it's just hard. People are dragging around chairs, doing different things. So how is your practice handling the waiting room process? Any words of wisdom on that one?
Good question. So presently we are seeing patients in our office at full speed based on what the patient wants. Having said that, we are also happy to accommodate with seeing people with telehealth if they prefer that as well. And for some things like rashes, we're relegating them more to telehealth because we feel like it's a really comfortable, quick approach for them. For some things like COVID risk symptoms, we are not seeing them in our regular office. We're seeing them in a respiratory clinic uniquely. And so that can mean a different provider as well. But we're happy to see them by telehealth, or happy to give them phone advice without having to see them as well. As far as during COVID or even pre-COVID, we do have waiting areas for parents, which are separate from the exam rooms. They're not just outside the door, they're down the hall and outside the door. And they're in positions which don't have full line of sight as well. So somebody doesn't see me going out to get my pregnancy test done before the parent comes in or things like that. We have also paid attention to recognize that we want to use that space minimalistically, and there's only one person there. And to that extent, we are not using it as much as possible, but still having it available to us. We also have people wiping down those chairs between parent use along those lines. And then what I've also taken advantage of is cell phones. And so there's a number of teenagers who come into my office for a well physical. We do the physical and the parent's out in the car. And at the end of the visit, I will get the parent on the cell phone. Usually I use the kid's cell phone because I know the parent's more likely to pick up their number than my number. And then what I'll do is I'll answer questions to the parent or tell the parent what the summary of the visit was, things like that. So they're still involved. I think it's really important for us to recognize that although we want to give one-on-one time for teenagers and young adults, we also want to involve parents as much as we possibly can because they are the support person at home. If they can provide the same platform and everything at home and that the supportive nature. And so we don't want to shut them out. This is not a game of secrecy. This is a game of getting the kid the service they need. And that's when we provide the privacy, if it's going to make or break the difference as far as getting the service that they need.
Great. Another question that had come up before that kind of spurred or sparked some of this webinar discussion was really focused around the whole back to school season with COVID coming, with COVID still here, back to school, regular flu, and just providers, looking for any kind of insights as to how they can best handle that. I mean, obviously use of telehealth as much as possible is probably helpful to kind of limit any spreading. But with back to school, sports physicals, all of that, that's supposed to be done if schools are playing sports, all of those different things. Have you kind of run into those scenarios? Do you have any advice on, I know I'm putting you on the spot with that stuff.
I think every office out there is overwhelmed with the back to school pieces at the moment. I've been very involved with the school health advisory group for the state. And they've rolled out recommendations related to what it requires to go back to school for various scenarios. This is not separate or unique for adolescents. This applies to all pediatric kids who are in school. We are just hoping that those advisory guidelines are being used uniformly, both by the schools and the doctor's offices, because both have a right to choose or adopt or not adopt those guidelines. But the uniformness will make it easier for everybody at the end of the day. And they are a change. The rule of thumb is if you're sick, you don't go to school. And if you're sick with high-risk symptoms or lots of low-risk symptoms, you get tested before you go back. And it's a lot of testing we're doing, a lot of phone calls, a lot of notes going back to schools, much more than previous years. And a lot of the schools are part of it, which is frustrating. But that's not unique to adolescents. What's unique probably to adolescents is I've been surveying them as far as, are they happy with the remote end for 2 days a week or the actual end 2 days a week? And because they're getting hybrid models left and right. It's about a 50-50 split. And that surprised me. Okay? So the kids who want to be in school are desperate to be back in school. And they never want school to end again. And they didn't realize that when they had it so good pre-COVID. And the kids who don't want to be in school, typically there's a little bit of generalization. They have more anxiety disorders amongst them. And they're happy as a pig in mud, sitting at home and doing the remote education and doing well with it in some cases. I'm also seeing kids with ADHD don't do so well in the home setting because there's not the structure driving through the homework and other things. But those are gross generalizations without data or studies supporting it fully.
And one more final question. I think we have time for one more. Have you kind of, obviously, likely there's a trend in increase of social isolation. Do you have any tips on conversations around talking about social isolation with adolescents especially?
It's a problem. What I struggle with the most is extracurricular activities, as I alluded to. But I recognize social isolation is a problem. It used to be part of my interview and saying if somebody was socially isolated, that was a problem. And now I got to say that's a good thing in part because it's safe. Having said that, we need to find alternative approaches. And so whether they're Zoom chatting with friends or doing things virtually or doing distance walks or distance type activities with a small cohort of people, somehow we need to replace the process of seeing nobody at all. And so that's an important piece. We also have seen a huge uptick in anxiety in general and requests for both consultations related to that as well as consultations from our counselors. And so we have a very strongly integrated approach between the physicians in our office and our counselors in our office and how to fast track people into the counseling approach as far as how to work with anxiety and how to deal with those, whether it's COVID anxiety or back to school anxiety or isolation and all the moods and things that come with it. Families have had mixed happiness being all at home. Some have loved it because they actually have more one-on-one time with their kid than they've ever had. And some are chewing each other's skin and don't have enough space. And that's a balance which is hard to deal with. So go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and with the more online connection, do you have conversations with adolescents at all about online safety and pieces like that?
Yeah, so hey, let's go. People can hate me, but 2 hours a day is hard to achieve during COVID when it comes to screen time. And even with that, the American Pediatrics nationally has been moving towards, it's not the 2 hours, but it's the quality of the screen time that's the more important thing. And to some extent, we're trying to push parents to recognize not necessarily the quality, but understand the content what your kid's using, and maybe that you're actually spending screen time with them so you understand it better. And so I have Snapchat and Twitter on my phone because I have some young adults in my life who taught me how to use it. And I'm doing that so I can trade better with them along those lines. Same thing for gaming, that I'm recommending some parents actually do some of the gaming with them as they have teachable moments and they understand what they're doing as far as gaming. Or how can they be smart users of media instead of just plain old maximum users of media. I threw out one other topic just because it's a cutting edge new thing is MyChart. And I just heard this morning, I'm excited after 3 or 4 years trying to achieve it, is that we're likely to have portals for parents of minors so that they will have limited access to their kids' medical record. And it'll be with the recognition that they'll be co-players with their kids' care. They won't be able to snoop in on everything, but they will have access to that. I've been working on this for 3 years now. We're hoping the other piece that might come with it at some point is that the kid has access to their own chart. And presently within the Maine health system, they have access down to age 17, which is new as 6 months ago. Before it used to be 18. But that 12 to 16-year-old still is kind of in limbo, and we're hoping that they get some limited access, mainly messaging to the doctor. And if they can get messaging to the doctor, that'd be a huge gain for a teenager.
Great. Well, thank you. We're out of time for today, but thank you for that. And if people have additional questions, they can definitely reach out to myself. My email will be kcole@mainmed.com or Dr. Fanberg. But thank you for presenting on this. I know there's often a lot of questions around the adolescent population, so we appreciate your expertise. And for everyone, the survey link is in the chat, but again, we'll send it out after the webinar as well, and you can complete that survey to download your CME at the end. Thank you.
And if you like the video links or dislike the video links, that'd be very helpful for us to know in the survey.
Yeah, definitely let us know feedback on the video interaction with the webinar. Well, thank you, everyone, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your afternoon.